Charlie Smith. It's the guy we're going to be listening to next. Charlie came up with a very good title, very simple. What good are grasslands? Because they're surrounding the whole river area here. So he's going to give us a tour of grassland habitats and some research, show some all kinds of good pictures. Anyhow, Charlie is a naturalist, educator, conservationist, and personal friend who retired from Cornell University in 2012. He earned his Ph.D. in wildlife ecology from Cornell and went on to hold various administrative capacities at the prestigious Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, including being executive director. Wow. He published Butterflies and Moths of the Smokies in 2019, co-authored with one of his former students, Elizabeth Dominique. He's a life member of the Tennessee Ornithological Society and the Wilson Ornithological Society, and a lifetime member of the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Locally, he serves as president on the Preserve Management Committee of the Finger Lakes Land Trust, and served 16 years on the town of Dryden, which is just outside Ithaca, of the Dryden Conservation Board. I will practice ornithological. That's a mouthful. Anyhow, let me turn it over to Charlie.
Ken, thank you for such a gracious introduction. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate the invitation from the Thousand Islands Association to speak to your group today. This is a new experience for me to be in the relative flatlands of the Northeast compared to where I grew up in the mountains of Tennessee to speak to a group like your own. I'm going to do that mostly with the use of slides, which I think each will be somewhat self-explanatory, with only a few comments from me. And I'm going to present some facts. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts, and I'll leave it to the slides to convey various impressions of grasslands as I've known and understood them for about 25 years in some ways. The question I always get, especially from members of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, were there ever grasslands in New York State? Depends on the time horizon. If you go back 8,000 years ago, there was a significant global warming event. We're not experiencing the first global warming by any means, and it was after the glaciers had retreated, and it extended eastward into parts of New York State with prairie habitats, true prairie habitats like we have in the Midwest, or had in the Midwest before they planted corn and soybeans. So there's evidence of that if you look around in New York State in two locations, Cicero Swamp east of Syracuse and Bergen Swamp over next to Rochester. We find this little rattlesnake, and this is not a baby, this one is full grown, called the Eastern Massasauga. It's a prairie rattlesnake. If you go further west, you find it in the prairies that still remain in parts of the West. Here in New York State, it's been forced into wetland areas by the settlement of the landscape and by the destruction of reptiles of all kinds, but especially snakes, over the last 200 or so years. So that's the biological evidence for there having been prairies in New York State. They basically were western New York, down the Mohawk River, and then over into, believe it or not, Long Island, the Hempstead Plains, with a few acres still remaining where Smithtown and Levittown now exist. If you come up a little closer to 1675, La Salle was an explorer here, and he had journals, and he is sort of a representative from the European continent to say to us that come on over. There are even wild cattle, which instead of hair, have a very fine wool. As he toured the Great Lakes, he probably saw some of these long time ago. The remnant today is probably Buffalo, New York. This is American bison. This project began for me about 25 years ago when, with a couple of colleagues, I published an article that pointed out that in the Northeast, it was not woodland birds that were in trouble. It was songbirds that associated themselves with open land habitats. We can call them grasslands. They no longer are true prairie grasslands, but we have grasslands around airports. We have grasslands for agriculture. And we have some grasslands in the rough on golf courses that serve that function today. As folks in the Finger Lakes region, particularly the Thousand Island Land Trust, know, managing grasslands is challenging. It requires a lot of work. You're trying to stabilize succession, keeping open areas, grassy areas from changing into shrublands and then into woodlands. And nothing succeeds like succession ecologically. Here are some examples of maintained grasslands. And grasslands are very productive. Excuse me. Marshlands are among the most productive of habitats, but grasslands are second only to marshlands. Some evidence of this in grassland habitats in the Northeast. We have a little bird I'll show you in a minute called the bobolink. Normally with birds it takes a pair, a male and a female, to raise fledglings in the nest. In grassland habitats, the areas are so productive that only one member of the pair, the female, has to secure food for the young. Food is so plentiful and so available that only one bird is required to feed the young. And so the males typically are polygamous, with one male associated with multiple females. Disclaimer here, I take pictures of birds occasionally. I rarely show my pictures of birds because they're not as good as some you're going to be seeing later. So what I've done is browse the web and in public domain sources selected some of what I think are the better picture of New York grassland birds that require grassland habitats for living and for raising young. These are obligate New York State grassland birds. Upland sandpiper, yes, it's more of a shorebird, we call them, than a sandpiper in some respects. This bird has a really distinctive sound, which I will try to imitate. So if you're out in an open land, like say on Amherst Island or some of the other islands, you may hear that beautiful wolf whistle. And don't be worried, folks, it's not whistling at you, it's just advertising itself. This is a ground nesting bird of prey. The northern harrier used to be called marsh hawk, but we've adopted the harrier name to be consistent with our European friends in ornithology. Beautiful little wren, sedge wren, hardly ever seen but often heard in the right situations. Many sparrows, and sparrows are not as much of interest to other folks because they're not brightly colored. And their songs are not distinctive like that of the upland sandpiper, but they've occupied much of my attention for the last 25 or so years. Grasshopper sparrow is named for its song, not because it eats grasshoppers, which it probably does, but its song sounds a little bit like that of a buzzy insect. And Henslow sparrow, even more diminutive in its song than are grasshopper sparrows. And here's the bobolink. This is the polygamous bird I spoke of earlier, one male associated with multiple females, because grasslands are so productive of insects that one female is able to feed a brood of young without real help from the male. And the most colorful of all the grassland birds, known to a lot of people, is the eastern meadowlark. And in New York State, 67% of these birds are state listed, and across the Northeast, all are declining in abundance. Some, like the Henslow sparrow, to a level that we simply are hard-pressed to detect them in the state anymore. Well, why? This is an example I took from Columbia County over in the Hudson Valley of New York. The amplitude of the graphs would be different across different counties. The patterns, I think, would remain the same. Declining numbers of farms, increasing areas of forested acres. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The thing that's driving all of this is increasing populations over time. There are just too many people on the landscape. And Pogo was right in the 70s. We've met the enemy, and he is us. So why so much about birds? Birds are flagship species in a sense. People relate to birds. If we preserve grassland bird habitats, other animals and plants benefit as well. And here are some of those other beneficiaries. With a warning, if there are any among the audience who are true herpetophobic, I'm going to show some pictures of snakes, so you might close your eyes. As Ken suggested, I've spent a lot of my time for the last 30 years, about half as long as I've spent studying birds, studying butterflies. I was encouraged by one of my students in the late 80s to start looking at butterflies. He knew butterflies. He's now a professor at Texas Tech University. And I'm going to share with you some of the really spectacular butterflies that can be found in grassland habitats. So there are a lot of things out there to look at. If you don't look at birds, look down and you'll see butterflies. And that's a good reason for learning the sounds of birds. You don't have to see birds to identify them. 90+% of my identifications outdoors are by sound or song alone. Then I can look for butterflies, and as one of my early mentors pointed out, you can also look for plants while you're listening for birds. So I guess the bottom phrase is you can multitask if you're outdoors and you really want to. Many of these snakes are snakes that occur in open lands of different kinds with different degrees of rockiness, and I see a lot of rockiness on the islands of the Thousand Islands. This little guy's scarcely the length of a lead pencil, a ring-necked snake. Not dangerous by any means. Decay snake, not nearly spectacularly colored, but similar size. These are little guys, 10 inches maybe at the most in size. We all probably know eastern garter snakes. They're great to have in your garden. One of the things they do like to eat are slugs. And so they're a slug control snake, if you wish to think of it that way. And the milk snake. We have very little information about reptiles. We're swimming in information about birds so much that the statisticians don't really know what to do with it. But this is a snake that the reptile enthusiasts suggest is declining, and it's a snake of open lands and grasslands throughout much of the Northeast. And with tribute to our Canadian friends, there are beautiful flowers in grasslands if you but take time to look at them. Canada lilies like grasslands, they're a little moist, not marshy, but maybe seasonally moist if there's enough rain in the spring. Now we do have native orchids in North America. You don't have to go to South Florida and the Florida Keys or to the tropics to see orchids. These are small. If you look at Laney's tresses, there's several species of Laney's tresses. This one is a rare one in New York State that I happened to discover on one of the grasslands I was studying here in the Finger Lakes region. There's a whole group of fringed orchids, and you can probably understand from what characteristic they get their names. They're beautiful like this. Some of them are beautiful purple color. This one happens to be one I encounter each year when I study birds in grasslands. So I invite you to think about it. If you've not read any of the writings of Aldo Leopold, please do. You can begin with a Sand County Almanac, a collection of his essays called Round River, from which this came. And Leopold invokes what we call nowadays the approach of the intelligent watchmaker. To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. Try not to throw any things away, especially if you don't know what they're good for. Thanks to Ken White for providing some suggestions and graphics, and also especially to Renee Carver for tutoring me in the use of Zoom. You can submit questions to Renee later. And I do thank you for your time. I think I've stayed within my allotted time, and I'll turn it over now to whoever's in charge at this point. I think it's you, Ken.